Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for today's presentation, which is entitled The Energy Crisis of the 1970s. I had to put 1970s in parentheses just in case folks were confusing it with our current energy crisis, which I've since learned is not as bad, nowhere near as bad as the 70s. But nonetheless, have you heard the phrase, not since the 70s lately? Well, there you go. On February 2nd, 1977, less than 2 weeks after assuming the presidency, Jimmy Carter addressed the nation in a televised fireside chat to speak to Americans about the looming energy crisis. So what tools and resources does the Constitution provide the executive branch to take on such a crisis? And what roles do the other branches of government play? This program will examine the 39th president's response to this crisis through the lens of primary sources at the Carter Library and National Archives. And it's led by Joshua Montanari, education specialist and volunteer docent coordinator at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. So all 50 of us or so, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Joshua for joining us here this afternoon. And Joshua, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here. Great to see everyone joining us from a few different parts of the nation. Also Massachusetts. I see some Danvers. I briefly lived in Danvers when I was a National Park Service ranger at Salem Maritime National Historic Site, Massachusetts. So it's nice to be reminded of that place and folks there. But yeah, I'm here today to talk with you about the energy crisis and President Carter's response to that event in our nation's history. So we can go ahead and get started. Just give me a moment to get my screen shared. I do have a video clip in it, so let me get the sound. And let me go from the beginning of my slide. Just give it a moment, please. And if you're at my last presentation, you might see a couple of slides from that as well. A lot of things in the Carter administration were so interwoven, interlapping. Sometimes I forget which presentation I'm giving because so much of them cross over each other. So there's our title slide for so planning for the future, President Carter and the energy crisis. You get a taste of what we'll be talking about there. We see some renewable energy, we see primary sources, artifacts, photographs. So I am the education specialist at the Carter Library, as Robert mentioned. Our parent agency is the National Archives. You might be hearing about that agency in the news these days, but we are basically the nation's caretaker of our history, of our primary sources, of our documents. We do have facilities all across the nation, not just in Washington, D.C. You can see a list of those on the side of the screen, although you do see our main building in Washington, where the founding documents are housed. Also have some great museum exhibits you can see in there as well if you visit our nation's capital. Here's a map of our current presidential libraries that are open to the public. We do have 13 of those. The Obama Library will be operated by the Obama Foundation, not yet open, but in the very near future. Trump Presidential Library is really just on paper. It's not a brick and mortar operation, so to speak, where you can visit. President Trump has yet to make that decision if he'll have a public-facing institution or not. But these are part of the National Archives. Typically, if a president decides to have a public-facing institution, they have to raise the funds for the land, for construction, and traditionally then management is handed over to the National Archives of its collection and its museum. We are, the Carter Library is in Atlanta, Georgia. Here's a shot from our museum floor. You can see some of our collection. Those are the actual storage containers for a part of that. We opened on Jimmy Carter's birthday in 1986, which is October 1st. In this one-term president's collection, we have 40 million pages of written materials, over 40,000 museum objects and artifacts, 500,000 photographs, and thousands of hours of film, audio, and videotape. Most of you are a little far away from us. It's a bit of a hike to get to Atlanta, Georgia. So if you don't have that pleasure, as former Vice President Walter Mondale did here in the photograph, you can go to our website, jimmycarterlibrary.gov, and see a lot of our collections, descriptions, frequently requested topics. If you go there, we have a lot of primary sources already gathered for you, and you can always reach out to an archives or me, specialist or me, with our Ask an Archivist and Education Specialist online form. So we're always happy to assist you with online research, whether you're an adult, whether you're a student, just let us know. We're here to help. And with that, we'll get to our program on the energy crisis. So that was a familiar sign, I think, for folks when this was happening. Today we'll be reviewing the circumstances of the energy crisis, connections to the Cold War, which usually isn't on the top of people's radars, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and we'll talk about Carter's response, including constitutional solutions, how he engaged Americans in the global community, and the impact of other crises happening in our nation at that time in the 1970s. So when I talk about the energy crisis, there are a lot of things happening in the Carter administration. I'm reminded of a quote from John Muir, that when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. As I alluded to before, that's what it seems like with many topics in the Carter administration, because there's so much overlap. So just something to ask yourself and contemplate, maybe which event do you think was most responsible or had the biggest impact on the energy crisis? Perhaps the hostage crisis in Iran, or maybe post-World War II population boom, Middle East peace process, or the Cold War. It's really a bit of a toss-up. Not trying to tell anybody what to think there. That's what the National Archives are all about, is presenting you with the primary sources for you to become the historian, you to make up your own mind about history. So hopefully we help you do that here today. I'm going to start with a short clip of President Carter speaking to set the tone for the program here. We're not watching the entire 30-minute clip, just a minute or so.
The heart of our energy policy is, the heart of our energy problem is that we have too much demand for fuel. It keeps going up too quickly while production goes down. And our primary means of solving this problem is to reduce waste and inefficiency. Our trade deficits are growing. We imported more than $35 billion worth of oil last year, and we will spend much more than that this year. The time has come to draw the line. We could continue to ignore this problem, as many have done in the past, but to do so would subject our people to an impending catastrophe.
Hello, I'm Paul Duke. On April
Okay, so President Carter kind of laid out the topic here, what we're talking about, what we're dealing with, and his view on how it was going to be solved. But we're going to go into the background of that now. A big part of the energy crisis was supply and demand of energy post-World War II. We had a huge population boom. We'll talk about that in the next slide. Exponential economic growth. We look at our foreign policy post-World War II. Dominating that is the issue of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And I think second to that would be the Middle East peace process, really a byproduct of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And we have an image here, I think a big part of our foreign policy after World War II, the Marshall Plan. Particularly there, we see that unfolding in Germany. If anyone's interested in more about that, our National Archives does have some more materials and things you can look at on the Marshall Plan. Have a link for that here. And this slide presentation can be shared with anyone who is in attendance today. I'll get that to Robert. He'll get that out to you. It will have active hyperlinks for you to access. So really, so looking at our population boom, exactly how much it was between 1940 and 1980, the United States population increases 71%. We didn't have a generation called the baby boomers for nothing. Real gross domestic product, or what our nation is outputting, the products of our labor, increases 508%. We really are the only superpower on Earth after the Second World War. Very different from today, but at that time, economically, industrially speaking, the rest of the world was more or less on its knees at that point after World War II. So we were really the only player in the game, so to speak. And all of that was made possible by a very heavy reliance on cheap fossil fuels and foreign oil that we just took for granted would always be cheap and available. We in the United States imported about a quarter or 25% of OPEC's oil during those years. We see an image of another byproduct of the population boom, suburbia that popped up in the United States. One we see over that we see there on the left-hand side, something very familiar to many of us today. Something else happening at the time, I just think worth mentioning, but it's there. The environmental movement has been growing in recent decades. When that big, that increase in gross domestic product and the population boom starts catching up with us a little bit later. The 1970s, it is President Nixon who creates the Environmental Protection Agency to help establish guidelines for the environment and enforce them. Really, we were looking at lowering carbon emissions and supporting conservation. So that's a factor going in to the energy crisis. Talking about the Cold War, here is the map where we stood geopolitically in that conflict. The red and pink being the Soviet Union and allies of the Soviet Union, the blue and light blue being the United States and allies of the United States. And when we talk about Middle East, we can see there those colors both being present, facing each other across their borders there. So again, as much as the Cold War affected Eastern Europe, it also affects the Middle East. The Cold War connection, basically the US and the Soviet Union engaged in that it was by proxy, hence Cold War. We never openly confronted each other. This does include Arab-Israeli conflicts in the Middle East taking place more or less from the late 1940s up through the 1970s. The United States' efforts to counter the Soviet influence in the Middle East later results in the Arab oil embargo from 1973 to 1974. The cost of oil went up 350%. That's really the beginning of this. We've all been feeling it in our pockets at the pump lately, but imagine this would be the equivalent of us paying $11 or $12 a gallon for gas today. That's the magnitude of the energy crisis in the 1970s. And we can see some primary sources on our screen about that. Children wondering, is the bomb going to drop? Gas stations being out of gas because of everybody filling up, not just their cars, containers, and them not being able to meet that demand. So we haven't quite gotten to that point. I think our recent crisis was somewhat moderate in comparison to this. So we mentioned those Arab-Israeli conflicts. Here is just a summarization of those beginning in 1948, more or less immediately after the United States recognizing the state of Israel. These begin. First in 48, the biggest one was in 67, the Six-Day War, but the one that sets the Arab oil embargo in motion is the Yom Kippur-Ramadan War of 1973. It was a very hard-fought Israeli victory, not as big of a victory as the Six-Day War. But for the United States' support of Israel in that conflict, the Arab oil embargo is instituted. That's during the Nixon and Ford administrations. And so we can relate to the impact on daily life. Again, it was exponentially more significant in the 1970s, but inflation soared, affects all sectors of the economy, increases consumer prices, Unemployment then rises with those increased costs to employers who are paying now for more fuel that runs their businesses and higher material costs. And the American public is looking to the government for intervention to control what they are calling stagflation, high unemployment, high inflation together. So currently we actually have one of the lowest unemployment rates in history, but we do have high inflation. So we don't have both of those happening as we did in the 1970s. And we just get another view of what was going on then when we see that rush on the gas station in Portland, Oregon there in December of 1973. So the Constitution more or less lays out a blueprint for any sitting administration or president how to address any crisis, really. So for this and other crises, Carter has congressional legislation at his disposal. Presidents, while they're not members of Congress, can influence passage of that. Executive action, here's where the president does have power. But a reminder that things like executive orders do not take the place of congressional legislation. Basically, more or less, they tend to be things that facilitate something that's already been implemented, but does not have specific instructions on how to go about implementing that law. That's typically what an executive order is, but we'll talk a little bit about that. And as president, Carter has extensive power when it comes to diplomacy, as they do appoint U.S. ambassadors, and they have the power to make treaties with foreign nations with the approval of 2/3 of the United States Senate. So just some basics to go over. It's always good to get back to our constitutional basics and remember that there is a process for resolving things, that we don't live in a dictatorship where someone just declares this or that. So some notable legislation passed by Congress in response to the energy crisis was the Emergency Natural Gas Act, more or less releasing more of that to the public, streamlining the process for doing that. The Department of Energy Organization Act, we see that being implemented in this photograph. That's the swearing in of our nation's first Secretary of Energy, James Schlesinger. So that created the Department of Energy. Before that, it was spread across multiple federal agencies. This really consolidated a lot of those offices into one agency, one cohesive agency to come up with a national energy plan, to plan for the future, not just address things as they come in a disparate manner, but to have a coalesced effort towards determining our energy needs and meeting and addressing them. We have the National Energy Act of 1978 and the Energy Security Act of 1980. So again, Congress just continuing to take action as the energy crisis continued, changed, unfolded. The government was responsive to it as best they could. One part of that, something I think everyone looks at, especially with prices where they have been, is fuel efficiency. That's something we see on the window of cars we're going to buy. What's the city mileage, highway mileage? That begins in 1980 with the Automobile Fuel Efficiency Act, set new corporate average fuel economy standards that were previously set during the Ford administration. Basically increases fuel efficiency, lowering carbon emissions. That's the goals. It promotes domestic automobile production, as we see happening here on the Cadillac assembly line in Michigan in June of 1973. Now here's where it gets, while we haven't just had a steady increase of progress on this, is that it does provide flexibility for future administrations to adjust standards in response to changing economic conditions. That does happen in subsequent administrations after the Carter administration. And then the judicial branch has a role to play in this. We've talked about the executive, we've mentioned the legislative branch with Congress. The judicial branch allows exemptions to antitrust laws for energy companies during times of crisis like we faced then. Perhaps something relevant to today. Maybe do some independent research, see if we have put any cases before the Supreme Court or asked, or if, I'm not sure if President Biden has requested that or not. I think that would be a great inquiry for someone to make. See, are we currently having exemptions, antitrust laws to help meet our energy demands? Here's just a laundry list of executive orders. We see Jimmy Carter over there metering out. And again, these do not, I repeat, do not take the place of congressional legislation. They do not usurp the Constitution. This is in that area where something is not explicitly assigned to somebody in the Constitution. So this is where the president of our country gets a little leeway in issuing executive orders. But you just look at the list there, kind of how I was saying, they really help facilitate and move along existing laws that are on the books. And there's hyperlinks to each one of these if you want to read those in greater detail in your own time. But just thought it was worth the audience knowing what Carter did while he was there, just to get an impression of how he used executive authority. The president has to engage Americans on this issue. I think as any president does in a crisis, you have to address the nation, be the face of our government, let everyone know what you're doing, where we're going with it. So Carter tries to appeal to all ages at that time. He has fireside chats, famous for wearing the sweater you see on the right there. In fact, if you come to Atlanta, you can see one of those on display in our museum exhibits. Use of pop culture. You can see on the left side of the screen a comic book that was created in cooperation with the Department of Energy and Marvel, with Captain America and the Campbell Soup Kids. Random combination, I know, called Battle of the Energy Drainers. President Carter, and actually it was Rosalind Carter, the First Lady, hosted Marvel characters at the White House, and Stan Lee, when the Department of Education was established as kind of a kickoff event. That was a neat thing. You can find photographs of that in our collection and in the National Archives. A National Energy Education Day was also established to try to engage the younger generations, who would be the future of solving energy crisis problems, to make them aware of what was going on and what our options were. And hopefully would pick up that mantle of leadership in the ensuing decades. This is when we really see renewable energy coming into the mainstream, and alternate forms of energy. Again, we had taken for granted that cheap oil. So, why are we going to put resources in another direction? The costs of this are low. We've already got existing infrastructure for it. But then we see those prices spike. So Carter's there with solar panels that he had installed on the White House roof. Now, they did not power the entire White House. This was new technology at the time. I believe those solar panels, one of which you can also see in our museum here in Atlanta, I believe they supplemented the heating of hot water in the White House. And that was about it. They've come a little way. They do a little bit more now, but that's what those were doing. Kind of a symbolic gesture to the nation that, hey, we're with you in this fight. We're doing what we can to try to explore these new sources of energy, to try to alleviate the burden on the American people. You can see other forms that Carter was embracing, wind energy, ethanol. We see that everywhere we go at gas stations. In fact, it's quite a gem if you can find a gas station advertising ethanol-free gas, which apparently is a little bit easier on your engine parts. But ethanol from corn, supplement the gas to help stretch it out a little bit more of a thinner. Coal, we were still looking at our existing forms of energy, including fossil fuels, natural gas, and nuclear power, which we'll talk a little bit about, which was relatively new at that time and really was, I think, the big hope for the future of energy. Now, Carter has to engage the global community, specifically the Middle East, where these conflicts are happening that destabilize global energy markets. You can really see the personal touch that President Carter took engaging Middle Eastern leaders, primarily Egypt and Israel. Egypt really was the spearhead of those Arab-Israeli conflicts over the years. So that is the nation that we are focusing on, trying to resolve differences between them and Israel. So we see these handwritten letters, and it's not just this one. If you go into our collections, really you can go to our website under our frequently requested and look under Camp David Accords. We have a lot of great primary sources readily available for you there. We see time and again the leader of the free world, who has quite a few staff at his disposal to dictate letters to, providing these handwritten, personalized letters to other world leaders. This one to Anwar Sadat. And you can really get a feel for it in the second page. Carter really builds him up. You know, the time is now, and your endorsements, what's going to make this happen. But I love the closing, though, showing you that personal touch. Literally saying, this is a personal appeal for your support. Your friend, Jimmy Carter, not yours in leadership, not respectfully, but your friend, Jimmy Carter. So maybe Carter really might have been the right person at the right time to bring that relationship to fruition. We also have domestic agreements, Alaska natural gas agreement with Canada. We kind of have Canada between us and Alaska. It's a necessity to speak with them about issues up there. Mexican natural gas agreement as well. Now, the Middle East peace process, the crux of that is the summit at Camp David. It was 13 days in September of 1978. Very contentious. I think the image here of Carter speaking with Anwar Sadat captures that very well. Sadat had threatened to walk out of these talks after becoming very frustrated with Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Carter made a personal plea for Anwar Sadat to stay, which he does. And the rest, more or less, is history. Those are successful talks, culminates in ends 4 decades of war between Egypt and Israel. They have diplomatic relations with each other. Israel withdraws from the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, which was a big deal for the man in the picture, Menachem Begin, Prime Minister of Israel. He had campaigned saying he would retire an Israeli settlement on the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. So this really bolstered the United States' relationship with Egypt, who had been in the Soviet Union camp side of the Cold War. This really not only brings peace to Israel and Egypt, it brings Egypt into the Western fold in the Cold War, and helps mitigate future Arab-Israeli conflicts. In fact, Israel and Egypt have not been at war in more than 40 years since this agreement was signed. So it has been a lasting peace. And so the energy crisis is just one of many things on Carter's plate in his term in office. I believe his Hamilton Jordan had a quote that there was one White House dealing with the hostage crisis in Iran, and one dealing with everything else, the energy crisis being a part of that. Again, double-digit unemployment and inflation. Then we have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1980, during which Carter institutes a boycott. At that time, Carter was also considering asking Congress to amend the Selective Service Act, or the draft, to include women, because he thought this could be the beginning of World War III. Did not turn out to be so. We did not have to amend the Selective Service Act. And then we have the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster. And on top of all of that, Jimmy Carter is facing a primary challenge in the 1980 presidential election from the gentleman we see with him in the picture here, brother of former President JFK, Ted Kennedy. So we'd mentioned congressional legislation before. When we're in that last year in the White House, Carter does pass the most comprehensive conservation law in American history, the Alaska National Interest Conservation Lands Act, or ANILCA. Now, aside from creating like 30, I believe it's 34 new federal public land units in the state of Alaska, a big part of the addressing the energy crisis was providing federal guidance to transportation and utility corridors in Alaska and oil and gas leasing, basically get those materials down to the lower 48, the rest of the country, to help us alleviate our demand for oil and natural gas. So that has a big impact on this crisis, and gives us some amazing national parks and national wildlife refuges and national forests and America's last wilderness up north. Just that we mentioned the nuclear energy, just a brief background on President Carter and nuclear energy. A lot of folks aren't aware that during his time in the military, he had studied nuclear reactor technology and physics when he was in submarine school after he graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1946. He's still the only president to have graduated from that institution. He is assisting in the design and development of nuclear propulsion plants for naval vessels, in other words, nuclear-powered submarines. And because of this knowledge, when the world sees its first nuclear meltdown, it is Jimmy Carter who leads the first response team in history at Chalk River Laboratories in Ontario, Canada in 1952. More or less, they have to reassemble the propulsion engine. They do that by practicing on a tennis court across from the facility. They have to do their work in 90-second increments. We now know that 90 seconds of work that they did at that time in 1952 gave them the equivalent of more than a year's threshold of radiation exposure by today's standards. Some would say maybe that's a great origin story for President Carter's endurance into his late 90s, where he's at currently. Sounds like a great comic book to me. So he knows a thing or two about nuclear energy, about the stakes of it, what's involved in it. So when we have the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster, Carter's kind of a good person to have in the White House at that time. We see an image from the National Archives here of 3 Mile Island that's in South Central Pennsylvania. That is the Susquehanna River. It's in relatively close proximity to the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. This was the result of mechanical failure and human error, which usually seems to be the recipe for most nuclear complications. This really turns public opinion against nuclear energy. So we thought this was going to be the clean, almost fix-all solution going into the future. But actually, we have not built any new plants that were not already proposed in the United States since. So that's a key word, proposed. And that gives you an idea of how long the process is for opening a nuclear facility, because we do have new nuclear facilities opening up still. In fact, there's one coming soon in Georgia, where I reside, but it was proposed while Carter was in office. But despite all of that, we still get about 20% of our energy supply today from nuclear energy. So it's interesting to posit, had we not had the disaster of 3 Mile Island, where would we be at today with our reliance on this energy source and our reliance on other energy sources? So I mentioned the hostage crisis in Iran. So this is really an unexpected blow to the Carter administration. We have the Camp David summits result in success, trying to get some control over oil prices. And then the hostage crisis in Iran happens. At that point, Iranian oil is nationalized. And you can see the spike in the chart there where I have that yellow arrow pointing. And you can kind of see that in comparison to some later spikes we have down the line. But that sends prices going right back up. So it really feels like we haven't solved anything after this takes place. So we can look back cumulatively here at Carter's response to the energy crisis. Again, his administration does create the Department of Energy, again, bringing those efforts across the government together into a more cohesive effort. So we now have the first comprehensive energy plan in our nation's entire history. We're not just going through it without any thought to the future. We're actually thinking about that now. U.S. imports of foreign oil does drop from 8.81 million barrels a day in 77 to 6 million barrels a day in 1981. You can check those numbers with the U.S. Energy Information Administration. The concepts of conservation and renewable energy are introduced into mainstream society. They might not take hold for a little bit, but they do come to the forefront of society. Everybody at least hears about them, even if they're not implementing them in their own lives. But stagflation does continue through the Carter administration, with inflation and unemployment both above 10%. That really carries over well into the Reagan administration. And even in the Reagan administration, they're able to tackle inflation, but unemployment back in the 80s, really remained relatively high at that point. So it seems like you can see multiple administrations trying to address that. It's tough to find a perfect fix-all solution to this problem. So just some questions for everyone to consider thinking about this topic. How effectively does the Constitution equip our government to resolve the energy crisis? Do you think it's hindered in any way? Do you think there's room for a constitutional amendment to help our nation or help our government better address crises like we saw in the 1970s and perhaps like we're seeing today? Now, maybe here's a really interesting one to consider. We mentioned that the judicial branch provided regulatory exemptions to energy producers that would typically be deemed unconstitutional in violation of anti-monopoly laws. Do you think that was justified in this crisis? I mean, that's really a kind of a big existential question. What is the point of having these laws or having the Constitution if when rubber meets the road, we just say, we'll suspend that. We'll forget about that for the time being. Not saying that's right or wrong. I just think it's an interesting constitutional question to consider for all of us. Maybe get our gears turning and maybe inspire us to look into some other issues in our nation's history and get better perspective on them. And just something to think about. I think we maybe know the answer to this question, but is energy a matter of national security? It is embedded in our lives. It seems there's little, if nothing, we can do these days that does not involve energy somehow. Even our leisure activities, maybe it involves us driving somewhere, using electricity in our homes. Something for you to chew on and think about. I always like to provide some further inquiry to folks. I don't like to be the end of the conversation. Please, again, check out online resources we have at jimmycarterlibrary.gov or at archives.gov with the National Archives. You can see what the Carter administration thought about their efforts to combat this crisis in the record of Jimmy Carter. We have briefing materials on the National Energy Plan that were provided to Carter. Again, codifications of presidential proclamations and executive orders. I highly encourage you to explore those, see what that's really all about. You can check out the U.S. Energy Information Administration's records on petroleum imports and exports, see our nation's habits over the years. Again, I mentioned Camp David resources. We have quite a few of those on the Carter Library website. I have a link that takes you directly to them. There's a really great Google Arts and Culture exhibit called Searching for the 70s. That's available online. That's really good to go through, trying to take you to the place where this is happening. C-SPAN has President Carter's fireside chat on energy, where he talks on greater length about what our nation's facing and how he plans to meet the challenges of it. Another great one is the Carter's Malaise speech, and that's curated by the American Presidency Project. So as mentioned, I'll make this presentation available in a PDF and share that with Robert, and he can disseminate to attendees. If you have the time, I highly encourage you to check these things out and spend a little time becoming your own historian. So that is the end of the program. Oh, and also if you have some students or you are a student looking to do a little bit of exercise in your primary source research, go back through the presentation, maybe pick a couple of the primary sources I had and analyze them with the National Archives document analysis worksheets. These are really great if we actually have any teachers in the group, students, any academics. It's always great to once in a while put the training wheels back on to help combat complacency. We all fall into it. So check out those document analysis worksheets. They're available in English or Spanish, and we have them for novice learners and for also secondary students / adults who haven't been in school for a while. So feel free to check all those out. And thank you all so much for joining me here today. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and hopefully we have a little bit of time to address some questions that you might have.
All right, Joshua, wonderful job as expected. An anonymous attendee asks, was the Strategic Petroleum Reserve created during the Carter presidency?
That's a really good question that I should probably have the answer for. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I will guess that it is, if not the Carter administration, probably between the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations. I'm going to bet on one of those three is when that comes into existence, but I don't know for sure. But great question. I'd be interested to know. If anyone in the group knows, feel free to put that in the chat. Someone wants to do a quick Google search.
Patricia says, thank you, Joshua, for sharing your program. Michelle says, this was very informational and interesting. Thank you. Gail says, I still remember the Jimmy Carter sweater TV talks and the gas station lines. She also wants to wish Jimmy Carter a belated birthday.
Oh,
and Gail also liked your cardigan, Joshua. Okay.
Thank you for recognizing. This is my fireside chat uniform, as I call it. I like to give in all my distance learning programs. Thank you.
When Michelle says, Michelle asks, when students ask how they can help, what would the answer be?
I think a great first response to that is be informed. We see a lot of parallels to today with our energy demands. A lot of folks, upset and angry, understandably, but I would say find out facts behind it, find out the actual circumstances behind it. Primary sources are there for us to learn from. They're not just there to be ornamental in a history project or ornamental in our collections. They're there for you to access, to become the historian, to make up your own mind about history. And as I like to say, act accordingly going forward. So get engaged with your history. And then I think from there, I think you'll discover where you want to go next. And I think that's up to each person on their journey when they delve into our nation's history and see what's there for them.
So Gail corrected me. I read her chat incorrectly. It was Rosalind Carter's birthday recently, not Jimmy's. So I apologize.
Yes.
Maddie says, very interesting and informative. Thank you. Robert, and by the way, Robert, we're hosting the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library next Tuesday at 2:00, week from today. Robert asks, what do you think the Reagan administration damaged Carter's efforts by rejecting his very assumption that this is an energy crisis? Maybe I missed a word in there, but I guess, do you think the Reagan administration damaged Carter's efforts by rejecting his very assumption that this is an energy crisis?
Okay, well, I don't want to necessarily say damage. Every president that comes into office has their own governing style. Carter was, many would say, very pragmatic, very straightforward, to the point. Some might even say almost like a parent, maybe kind of like a parent telling us to eat our vegetables. Reagan's, wanted to put the American public at ease. I know I get asked quite often, did Ronald Reagan take the solar panels Jimmy Carter put up on the White House down? Yes, he did. But I think when he does that, I think it's a gesture that, there's no reason to panic, that we're going to be able to meet our energy needs going forward. It might not be perfect, but we don't have to panic. And again, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with Ronald Reagan's move there. As far as fuel standards, I mentioned there was flexibility provided to succeeding administrations after Carter to amend those in response to changing circumstances. So that was his administration's right to change those. It wasn't illegal what they did. Might have changed the trajectory of things that the Carter administration had determined was the right path for our nation. So, again, I don't want to say damage. I would say they took the country in a different direction, I would say, during his time in office.
Barbara says, when I was in fifth grade, this was back in 74, 75, we studied the Alaska pipeline. In general, the government pushed it by saying we would never have to import any more oil. But it seems that the Alaskan oil is being exported, and we are being told that America does not have enough energy domestically. What happened to Americans using Alaskan oil?
Okay, well, first off, I'm not, just so everyone understands, I'm not the spokesperson for the government. First, I would say the Alaska oil pipeline was a great example of cooperation across administrations. First proposed in the Nixon administration, continued to the Ford administration, I believe completed during the Carter administration. So that's something positive to latch onto there. I think generally speaking, while our nation has these great sources of oil, we don't so much have the capacity to refine it as much as other countries in the world. A big reason why we import things from them, because it's not the cleanest business, refining oil into the finished products that we use. Naturally, a lot of us let our representatives in Congress know we don't want that in our backyard. We're also trying to keep our air cleaner, all of that. It's all kind of a bigger picture there. So we do use Alaskan oil. Yeah, I can't say they were probably the most accurate, saying that we would never have to import anything again because of Alaskan oil. Again, that's unrefined oil we're talking about, but I mean, it does help in the bigger picture. But no, it wasn't a solve all and end all solution to everything. Just like if we tap the emergency oil reserves, I think we've all seen that. What does that do? Maybe lowers our gas prices 10, 15 cents. Depending on the vehicle you're driving, that maybe doesn't make a big difference, or maybe it makes a huge difference for you. But it was just a part of the solution. I can't, I can't justify or make any excuses for someone saying that was the end all solution. But that, I guess that's what they call, that was just someone trying to get that across be civically engaged to get that accomplished. Again, it was a part of the solution, not the whole solution.
Teresa says, thank you, very interesting and informative. James says, thank you for putting this on and sharing. Anne says, I enjoyed this presentation. It was well organized and I learned a great deal. I was often in line trying to get gas for my car so I could get to work as a teacher. Your use of slides and PowerPoint made the presentation easier to follow, as I could use both my visual and auditory senses. And as Joshua mentioned, I will be emailing the slides out to everyone tomorrow. Gail says we should ask the Reagan presenter about what Reagan did regarding the hostages and the election versus opponent Carter. Start coming up with your questions now, Gail, okay? And then I wanted to save this question for last. This was the first question asked, but I'm going to end it with this question, which is sort of unrelated to the topic at hand, but it actually dovetails nicely into our November topic. James says, I was at the President Carter Library in 2016. I was informed there that Camp David was the biggest thing he completed in his term. Do you feel that this is true?
Okay, I have a very interesting perspective on that. I mean, it's definitely one of the landmark accomplishments of the Carter administration. I had the honor and privilege to be in an audience with President Carter, I'm going to say 2019, down in Plains, Georgia, where he and Rosalind reside. I was at a meeting with interns of the Carter Library and the Carter Center. One intern asked President Carter what the greatest accomplishment of his administration was. And without hesitation, Carter answered that normalization of diplomatic relations with China was the greatest accomplishment of his administration, in his opinion. So there's that.
There you go.
Probably not the answer you were expecting.
But on Tuesday, November 29th, so this is like after Thanksgiving, folks. So in more than 3 months, Joshua will be back to talk about the Camp David Accords on Tuesday, November 29th, 2 o'clock via Zoom. Last comments here. Katrina says, thank you for a great presentation. Gail says, I met President Carter after his presidency. He's a class act and kind and gracious. So we'll wrap it there, Joshua. Any last words for the group?
I would just say thank you so much for attending. I like to think that I hope that everyone learned something from this. I hope everyone's going to do some further inquiry when they after this, and when they review my presentation. Again, I don't want to be the person telling you what to think about history. I just want to point you in the right direction for you to make up your own mind about it. So thank you all for being here with me today, for providing me the opportunity to speak with you. And I'm looking forward to coming back after Thanksgiving to go into greater detail about the Camp David Accords, because I may or may not think that might have been the greatest accomplishment of his administration.
There you go. Good cliffhanger. So thanks so much, Joshua. Thank you, everyone, for viewing today. Look for an email tomorrow morning, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Very welcome.